I rented the cabin because it was cheap, plain and simple. I'd been working long shifts at the mill and needed 3 days alone. No coworkers, no phone, no noise. The listing said it was a rustic fisherman's retreat about a mile from Lake Superior. It looked solid enough in the pictures: log walls, a small front porch, a dock out back that stretched into the fog. When I arrived, the air smelled like wet cedar and salt. A cold wind came off the water, the kind that finds its way into your sleeves no matter how tight you pull them. The owner had left the key under a rock near the steps, just like he said. I found it easily and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. No traffic, no neighbors, not even birds. Just the distant hush of waves against the rocks. Inside was small but cozy. One main room, a narrow kitchen, and a sleeping loft up top. The place had that old cabin smell: dust, pine pitch, and a hint of damp earth. The door was heavy, solid wood, with a brass latch that clicked cleanly when I closed it. I remember thinking how secure it felt, how the lock gave that firm sound that tells you it's built to last. It started raining that evening, slow and steady. I made dinner, a simple can of stew, and watched the water ripple across the lake. By 10, I was ready to sleep. I checked the door, turned the latch, and even slid the small wooden bar across it for good measure. The wind howled a little outside, but inside everything was warm and still. I climbed the ladder to the loft, turned off the lamp, and let the rain lull me. I woke to the cold. The fire had gone out, and the air in the cabin felt wrong, sharp, open. I sat up and looked toward the main floor. The front door stood wide open. Wind pushed the curtains out like pale ghosts, and rain sprayed across the floorboards. I climbed down, half asleep, shivering. The latch was still in the locked position. The wooden bar had fallen sideways onto the floor. I figured maybe the wind had caught it somehow. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way. I shut it firmly, tested it twice, and stood there for a moment listening to the rain batter the roof. Everything else seemed fine, so I went back to bed. The same thing happened again around dawn. I woke to the soft flap of the curtain and the sound of rain hitting the floor. The door was open, not wide, but enough to let the cold air crawl in. I cursed under my breath, got up and checked it again. The latch was stiff, but it worked. I pulled it tight, then wedged a chair under the handle before going back up. When morning came, I made coffee and tried not to overthink it. Old cabins shift, doors swell and stick. It's nothing new. I told myself that all morning while I read and watched fog drift across the lake. But the thought stuck. A door doesn't open twice on its own, especially not with a chair pressed under it. That evening, the wind picked up hard. The rain turned to a steady downpour, the kind that seems to come from all directions. Around 10, I checked the door again, still locked tight. I set my small camera phone on the table, aimed at the door, and hit record. I don't know why exactly, maybe just to prove to myself it was the weather. I climbed up to the loft and lay awake, listening. The sound of rain on the roof mixed with the creak of the logs. For a while, nothing else. Then, maybe around midnight, the latch clicked. A single, sharp sound, clean and deliberate. The air moved. I held my breath. The door didn't slam open like before. It eased itself open, slow, quiet, until it hung halfway. The wind outside moaned through the gap. I could see faint light from the lake, a dull reflection moving in the rain. My body felt pinned to the mattress, caught between logic and fear. I whispered to myself that it was pressure or wind or bad carpentry, but every explanation sounded thin. I stayed still until morning light crept through the windows. When I climbed down, the floor was damp again, scattered with pine needles blown in from outside. The chair was still wedged under the handle, but the handle had turned above it, the latch still in place. The camera sat where I left it, red light blinking that it had finished recording. I played it back. For the first 10 minutes, there was nothing but the soft rhythm of rain. Then around midnight, the latch clicked with a metallic clink. The door opened halfway, then stopped. The camera caught a faint shimmer in the air, not movement exactly, more like the shape of heat over asphalt. The frame darkened for a moment, then the door closed on its own. Not slammed, just eased shut until the latch clicked again. I watched it twice, then deleted the video. It didn't feel right keeping it. By that point, I was done pretending it was normal. I packed up my bag, but the rain was too heavy to risk driving the old dirt road out. I had to wait it out one more night. That afternoon, the wind howled so loud it drowned every thought. The lake turned to gray chaos, waves slapping hard against the rocks. Inside, the walls creaked and the lamps flickered. I pulled the chair closer to the fire and waited for dark. When it came fast, the kind of dark that eats the world whole. I didn't turn off the lights that night. I sat facing the door, the firelight dancing behind me, coffee going cold in my hand. Hours passed. The clock on my phone read 1:13 a.m. when I heard it. The latch clicked again. The door eased open, inch by inch, until the cold poured in. Wind bent the flame sideways, throwing my shadow across the walls. I didn't move. I didn't speak. There was nothing to see in the doorway, just rain and the faint outline of the trees. Then slowly, the door began to close again. The latch clicked. Silence returned. I stood, shaking, and reached out to touch the handle. It was warm. That was enough for me. I grabbed my bag, threw on my jacket, and waited for daylight, sitting upright in the chair, flashlight in one hand, my pistol on the table beside me. The rain finally broke at dawn. Mist rolled off the lake in long ribbons. I didn't bother cleaning up or leaving the key. I just left. The road was washed out in places, but I made it back to town by noon. The owner didn't seem surprised when I told him about the door. He just nodded and said, "That old place doesn't like being empty. Don't worry, it never hurts anyone. It just opens up sometimes." I didn't ask what he meant. Now, whenever a storm hits, I still dream of that sound, the clean click of a latch in the dark, the faint rush of air that follows, the feeling of a door opening to something that never needed to knock. The car broke down somewhere in the West Virginia foothills, miles from the main road. The rain had been chasing us all afternoon, gray and endless, until the engine gave a sigh and died right in the middle of nowhere. With no cell service and daylight fading, Caleb and I decided to look for shelter rather than sleep in the car. A half-mile down the road, we spotted a dirt trail with an old wooden sign that read Sportsman's Lodge. The letters were so faded they looked like ghosts of themselves, but the arrow pointed uphill, so we followed it. The path climbed through thick trees, the rain soaking through our jackets, until we reached a clearing with a long wooden cabin crouched under the pines. The place looked abandoned but cared for, the kind of building that hadn't been used in years yet somehow resisted falling apart. Its porch stretched across the front with 2 doors, one on each end, and 6 windows staring into the mist. A single lantern hung crooked by the steps. We knocked, waited, then pushed the nearest door open. Inside smelled like pine, dust, and rain. The air felt stale but not dead. There was a small fireplace, a few wooden chairs, and an old counter that once might have served as a check-in desk. It wasn't much, but it was dry. I lit my small battery lantern, setting it on the counter, and its amber light filled the room just enough to feel safe. We went through the motions, checked the back door, hung our jackets, pulled 2 chairs close to the hearth. I even laughed once, saying, "It's not the Ritz, but at least it's got a roof." Caleb nodded, stretching out with his boots off. The rain softened outside, steady and hypnotic. By nightfall, we were both half asleep in the warm quiet. Then came the footsteps. They started as soft creaks along the porch boards, slow and measured, like someone taking careful steps from one end to the other. 3 boards groaned, a pause, then 2 more. Caleb looked over at me, eyebrows raised. We waited. The sound came again, the same rhythm. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah." I stood, listening. The pacing stopped. The rain filled the silence for a while, then the steps started again, closer this time, just beyond the window. "It could be the wind," Caleb offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. Wind doesn't walk. I took a few slow steps toward the window and peered through the glass. The porch was empty, just rain running off the roof, dripping into puddles. Nothing moved. We told ourselves it was wood swelling, the building settling, anything ordinary. But a few minutes later, the footsteps came again. This time they stopped right by the door. A single board creaked, followed by another. Then, stillness. I said, carefully, "If anyone's out there, you're welcome to come in and get dry." My voice sounded smaller than I meant it to. No reply. Just the soft hiss of rain. I waited another minute, then reached for the latch. "Don't," Caleb whispered. But I opened it anyway. The porch was empty, but there were footprints. Bare ones, small and narrow, dark with rainwater. They stopped at our door and went no farther. I felt the cold crawl up my spine. Caleb stood beside me, staring. He said, "Man, those are fresh." We closed the door and slid the bolt. I set a chair under the handle, the way you do in old movies, even though I knew it wouldn't help much. We sat back down and listened. The pacing started again after maybe 10 minutes. Same rhythm, same calm patience. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't try the handle, just walked. By midnight, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been. Then came a new noise, 2 light taps on the far door at the other end of the lodge. Not a knock, more like a fingertip testing the wood. Caleb and I stared at each other, neither moving. The tapping came again, a little firmer. Then, nothing. I said, "We're leaving it shut." He nodded quickly. We didn't talk much after that. The rain settled into a gentler rhythm, wind brushing through the pines like waves. The building creaked softly as if breathing. Every so often one of us would glance at the doors, half expecting the handle to turn. It never did. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have drifted off sitting upright, because the next thing I knew, weak gray light was slipping through the windows. The rain had stopped. The world felt washed clean. We checked the porch. The footprints were still there. Darker patches where the wood was wettest, and now there were more of them. They led from one door to the other, overlapping in odd patterns, all turned toward the lodge. Not a single print went down the steps. We packed up quietly, leaving the place we found it. At the bottom of the trail, a county truck passed, and the driver slowed when he saw us. He rolled down his window. "You boys hiking out of the lodge?" "Yeah," I said. "Didn't know it was still standing." He chuckled. "Barely. My granddad used to guide hunts out of there. Closed after a flood. Folks say they still hear someone pacing that porch on rainy nights. He used to keep watch for the hunters coming in." I forced a smile. Guess he's still on shift. The man tipped his hat and drove on. Caleb and I didn't say much on the hike back to the car. We just listened to the water dripping from the trees and the crunch of gravel under our boots. When we reached the road, the air smelled sharp and clean. I turned once to look up toward the ridge, but the lodge was hidden behind mist again. Nothing visible but the dark line of trees. That night, after we made it home, I kept thinking about the rhythm of those footsteps. 3 boards, pause. 2 boards. Over and over. Patient and steady. I told myself it was water, wind, or memory trapped in wood. But some nights, when rain hits the roof just right, I still hear that pattern and catch myself listening for the rest of the walk.
When my aunt passed away, she left me her cabin in the Smoky Mountains, a place I barely remembered from childhood visits. My wife, Erin, thought it might be the change we needed after a busy few years in the city. The idea sounded good. Fresh air, quiet mornings, a little distance from everything that always needed doing. So that summer, we packed what we could into the truck and drove 6 hours south. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by trees so tall they hid the sky. It wasn't large, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled faintly of cedar, and a front porch that looked out over the valley. The floorboards were the first thing I noticed. They were old but solid, wide planks of oak that groaned softly with every step, the kind of sound that gives a house its own slow rhythm. The first week was peaceful. We'd wake to fog rolling through the trees, spend afternoons reading or cleaning, and end each day with the sound of rain tapping the tin roof. Erin loved it immediately. She said the house felt kind, like it was happy to have people in it again. I laughed, but I knew what she meant. It started small, little things you could explain away. One night while we were sitting on the couch, we both heard faint murmuring. Not outside, not upstairs, but beneath us. I turned off the TV and the sound stopped. We shrugged it off as plumbing or air moving under the floor. But later, when I got up to turn out the lamp, I could have sworn I heard it again. A low, layered whisper, like several people talking at once, too quiet to understand. A few nights later, Erin heard it too. We were lying in bed when she said, "Do you hear that?" I listened. There it was, that same soft babble, words overlapping, slow and patient. We both leaned over the edge of the bed. It was definitely coming from beneath the floorboards. The next morning, I checked under the house. It stood on old stone pillars, maybe 3 feet off the ground. Nothing under there but dry dirt, a few cobwebs, and a small crawl space vent. No pipes, no wiring, nothing that could make a sound. We tried not to talk about it for a while, thinking maybe ignoring it would make it stop. But it didn't. In fact, the whispers began to come more often, always late at night, always when we were quiet. Sometimes they were soft enough to pass as the wind. Other times they grew distinct enough that I caught familiar words. My name, for one, then Erin's. One evening, as I was reading on the couch, I heard it clearly, a short phrase repeated twice in Erin's voice. "Did you hear that?" The exact same tone and timing she'd used a few nights earlier when she first noticed the whispers. I froze. The real Erin was in the kitchen, humming softly as she dried dishes. The voice under the floor stopped as soon as I stood up. I walked to the kitchen and asked, "Did you just say something?" She shook her head, smiling. "No, why?" "Just thought I heard you call me." She frowned a little, but I let it go. That night the whispers were louder. I could almost pick out phrases, fragments of our own conversations, stitched together wrong. My words, her words, moments we'd said earlier that week. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, while under us the voices murmured in a rhythm that almost matched our breathing. By now, sleep came in fragments. Erin started keeping the radio on softly for background noise, but the whispering always found its way through, threading itself between songs, beneath the rain, behind every quiet pause. I started checking things more obsessively. Every nail, every vent, every gap under the floor. The cabin was sound, but the noise persisted, always in the same place, right below the center of the living room. One afternoon, while Erin was out walking, I pulled the rug and pried at one of the boards. The wood lifted with a sigh. Beneath lay only dark soil, dry, undisturbed. No tunnels, no holes, no signs of animals, just a faint smell of dust and pine sap. I hammered it back in place, but when I stepped away, the floor groaned in a long, low note, almost like a sigh of relief. That night, the whispers didn't come, not once. For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. But silence in that place didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. 2 nights later, they returned, louder, clearer, almost conversational. I woke up to Erin sitting upright in bed, staring toward the living room. The whispering was there again, pulsing in and out like waves. We crept to the doorway and listened. Someone was speaking in full sentences now. I couldn't make out every word, but I knew the cadence, my own voice. It was my voice, faint but recognizable, repeating something I'd said earlier that evening about the weather. Erin grabbed my arm and whispered, "That's you." I nodded, throat dry. We stood frozen for what felt like a long time. The voices continued, hers now mixed with mine, replaying old conversations, laughing softly, whispering phrases from days ago. Then, just as suddenly, they faded back into the soft hum we'd first heard weeks before. Neither of us slept. At sunrise, we packed a few bags and drove into town. We didn't talk much on the way. Over breakfast, we agreed to take a few days away to clear our heads. Aaron booked a small motel room by the highway. That night, as we lay in a strange bed surrounded by normal sounds, cars, voices, TV static, she said quietly, "It was repeating us, like the house was learning." We went back 3 days later to pack the rest of our things. The cabin was still and clean, dustier than we left it, as if it had been empty longer than a week. The air smelled different, dry, unused. I lifted the rug out of habit and pressed my ear to the floorboards. Nothing, just the old quiet of wood and air. We sold it a few months later to a retired couple from Florida. I never told them about the whispers. Sometimes when the rain falls just right on our new house, I catch myself listening to the floors. The boards here are newer, tighter, but they still creak when you walk at night. And every now and then when the house is quiet and I'm alone, I think I hear faint murmuring somewhere below, the familiar rise and fall of voices I almost recognize, speaking softly in the dark, as if still trying to remember how we used to sound.
When I took the maintenance job at Pine Hollow Resort, I thought it would be an easy season. A few cabins tucked around a small lake in northern Oregon, quiet guests, and nothing more demanding than fixing leaky faucets or chasing out squirrels. The owner, a man named Walter, ran the place with his wife. They lived in the main lodge, and I got cabin 1 as part of the deal. It wasn't glamorous, but it was clean and the air smelled like pine needles and rain. By mid-June, the place settled into a rhythm. Families came on weekends, fishermen during the week. By evening, you could walk the gravel road that looped around the cabins and hear nothing but water lapping against the docks and the soft buzz of insects. It was the kind of quiet that makes you forget the world has other sounds. That's why the light in cabin 8 caught my eye. The resort had only 10 cabins, spaced wide apart along the lake. Number 8 sat farthest from the lodge, half hidden by fir trees. It hadn't been rented in years. The plumbing was bad, the wiring outdated. We used it to store extra mattresses and furniture, and the power was supposed to be shut off entirely. One night, around 11 p.m., I was locking up the boathouse when I saw a warm glow through the trees. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe moonlight on the lake, but it was steady, the yellow of a lamp or an old bulb burning behind glass. I stood there a long time, trying to remember if I'd forgotten something earlier. I walked up the path toward cabin 8. The rain had started again, a slow mist that turned the light to a halo. The windows were fogged, but through them I could make out the shape of furniture and someone moving. A silhouette crossed the window once, then again, slow and deliberate. I knocked on the door. "Hello? Resort maintenance here." No answer. The rain ticked softly on the porch roof. I tried the handle, locked. When I pressed my ear to the wood, I heard faint music, like an old radio playing low. I stepped back, uneasy. I knew every booking that week. No one was in cabin 8. I walked back to the lodge and told Walter what I seen. He looked up from his newspaper, frowning. "Light in 8?" he asked. "You sure?" "Pretty sure. Thought maybe one of the guests wandered in." He rubbed his chin. "Keys are all here," he said, pointing to the rack on the wall. "Power's been cut for years." He stood, grabbed a flashlight, and followed me down the path. When we reached the cabin, the light was gone. The windows showed only our reflections. He tried the handle, still locked. He shined the light through the glass. Everything looked as it should. Dust, covered furniture, no footprints on the floorboards. He finally said, "Probably reflection off the lake," and clapped me on the shoulder. "Rain plays tricks." Maybe it did, but the next night, the light was back. Same warm glow, same faint movement inside. I didn't go near it that time. I stood halfway down the path, watching. The curtain twitched once, as if someone brushed it from inside. Then the light blinked out. The following morning, I walked up in daylight. The door was still locked. The ground was dry under the porch, though it had rained all night. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. I told Walter again. He sighed. "You're working too late. Go fishing once in a while. Cabin 8 hasn't been used in years." I tried to let it go. 2 weeks passed. The guests came and went. The forest thickened with summer green. The days blurred together. Then on a Thursday evening, a new couple checked into cabin 7, the one right beside 8. They were middle-aged, polite, a little quiet. The next morning at breakfast, the wife came up to me while I was restocking firewood. "Excuse me," she said, "do you have someone staying next door?" "No, ma'am," I told her. "That cabin's closed." She frowned. I must have heard wrong then. I thought I heard someone talking over there last night. Music, too. I nodded, pretending not to think much of it. I said, "Sound carries strange over the water." That night I walked the loop again after closing the boathouse. Sure enough, cabin 8 was glowing like a lantern through the trees. This time I forced myself to go closer. The door was still locked, the window fogged. Inside, I saw a bed neatly made, a chair pulled up to a table, and a half-full coffee cup sitting beside an old radio. The radio's dial glowed faint orange, static whispering from its speaker. I stepped back, heartbeat quick. When I turned to leave, a voice spoke quietly behind the door. I couldn't make out the words, but I know it was a man's voice. Low, steady, talking like he was finishing a thought. Then silence. I left quickly, not running, just walking fast enough that my breath came in short bursts. When I got back to the lodge, I didn't mention it. The next day, I went down to the power shed, and the breaker labeled Cabin 8 was still off. I flipped it on and off a few times to be sure it hadn't been touched. By the weekend, the couple in 7 checked out early. They didn't complain, just left a note. "Thank you, but we didn't sleep well." After they left, I decided to take one last look. It was late afternoon, light filtering gold through the pines. The path was dry, the air still. When I reached the cabin, the door stood slightly open. No light, no sound. Inside, everything was spotless. The bed perfectly made, coffee cup empty, radio unplugged. But on the floor by the door, wet footprints. There, faint, leading out onto the porch and disappearing into sunlight. I closed the door gently, locked it from the outside, and left the key hanging on the nail inside the frame where Walter kept it. That was the last summer I worked there. Sometimes, when it rains and the power flickers at home, I still picture that warm glow behind the trees. the quiet shape of a man who never checked in, still sitting at his table, waiting for company in cabin 8.
I was at the mountain outpost to log a week of weather data for the park's geology team. Barometric pressure, rainfall rates, soil saturation, and a half dozen other numbers that make sense to people in rubber boots. The place sat high in the Idaho backcountry, where the ridges fold over each other like gray knuckles. The outpost itself was simple. One-room cabin with an attached shed, metal roof, radio on the desk, cot in the corner, and an old stovepipe that rattled when the wind came down hard. I drove in on a Monday, just as the first drop started, pulled the door shut behind me, and heard the sound I thought I'd be hearing all week, rain on tin. It didn't build gradually the way storms usually do up there. It settled in, a steady, uninterrupted patter that never seemed to drift or slack. The kind of rain that finds a rhythm and keeps it, like a metronome that refuses to be argued with. I set out the manual gauge on the post by the steps, checked the tipping bucket recorder, and filled the logbook headings: date, time, temp, pressure, wind. Nothing unusual. The first evening, I boiled water for instant soup, drank strong coffee, and waited for the line of showers to roll through like always. They didn't. The rain stayed right where it was, marking time on the roof. Day 2 was the same. I woke from a shallow sleep to the same exact sound, went outside under my hood, and found the same thin curtains of water sliding out of a low ceiling. The gauge had climbed a little, 8 millimeters overnight, so I emptied it and wrote the number down. The wind remained gentle, the pressure steady, the clouds featureless. Late that afternoon, the radio crackled, and another tech checked in from a lower station. "You getting this?" he asked. I said I was. He laughed without humor. "It hasn't stopped in 29 hours. I'm at the creek crossing. Water hasn't risen at all. Feels like somebody turned the sound on and forgot the water." That's not how it works, but I knew what he meant. The world had a soundtrack, and the picture wasn't keeping up. By the third day, my ears had adjusted to the noise so completely that silence felt like something I'd never earned. I did the rounds, precip gauge, fog readings, soil probe, and found the smallest changes. A little more water in the tube, yes, but not what the noise suggested. The ground wasn't swelling into mud. It was damp at the surface and stubbornly firm an inch down. The metal roof should have shed sheets. It didn't. The rain arrived in perfect fine lines and left in perfect fine lines, as if the air itself was practicing a trick and didn't want to break the form. I slept in short runs that week, 20 minutes here and there. The outpost had that dry wood smell that sticks to your clothes, seasoned with a hint of iron from the stove and a trace of old mouse. On the night of day 3, a new detail slid in under the roof noise, a faint tick, tick, tick from above the rafters. It wasn't the sharp metallic ping you get when a roof cools. It was softer, rounder, water on wood. I got up, turned off the lantern to listen better, and stood there in the dark, feeling the room breathe. Tick, tick, slow and patient. I climbed onto the chair, pushed the attic hatch up with my palm, and held it there while the cold air dropped around my face. Dust, a paper-dry smell, emptiness. No drip on my forehead, no scent of wet. I slid the hatch shut and went back to the cot. The sound kept going. I fell asleep with the puzzle lodged in my jaw. Morning brought the same rain on the roof and the same stillness in the trees. Birds weren't making much of anything of it, which is sometimes a sign. I checked the gauge, 3 millimeters. I had heard 10 times that by ear. I hesitated with my pencil over the logbook and wrote what the instrument said anyway. Numbers keep us honest. Around noon, I did another loop and noticed something that settled the small hairs on my forearms. The underside of the eaves, where the roof overhangs, was dry. It should have been beaded, streaming off the drip edge, but the wood under there held only old weather stains and a fine layer of dust. Rain above, nothing below, as if the sound had gotten stuck on the skin of the metal and refused to cross space. On the radio at dusk, I asked headquarters if any anomalies had been reported. The reply was half static, half boredom. Widespread showers, keep logging. I ate crackers and cheese and watched the clouds go nowhere. The tick from the attic returned at the same hour, as if the day itself had a schedule. I opened the hatch again and shined my headlamp along the rafters. The beam caught the usual things: nails rusted at the head, wasp paper abandoned on a beam, a box of old tags from another season, but no wet, no darkening of wood, no bead of anything. I held my breath and heard the drip clearly, inches from my ear, on something that wasn't there. The light flickered, and I closed the hatch with a firm push.
By day 5, I had convinced myself of 3 possibilities. There was a seam leaking into a place I couldn't see. Sound was reflecting strangely between layers of roof and attic. Or I was tired enough to hear patterns that didn't exist. I am not someone who argues hard with the obvious, so I set a pan on the attic floorboards directly beneath where the sound seemed strongest. If there was water, I'd find it. That evening, the tick resumed, steady as a heartbeat, and I lay awake counting. 120 drops by my rough math. Then I slept. In the morning, I climbed up and checked the pan. Bone dry. A perfect circle of dust inside, undisturbed. That was the morning the rain got inside my head. Not metaphor. My ears balanced themselves around the sound until the world without it felt wrong. The silence inside the attic when I ducked up there, the empty pan where my logic should have found a puddle, both pressed against my patience. I stepped outside bareheaded in a break of resolve and felt the rain on my face. It was there. It was cold. It was water. But when I held my hand out, palm up, the drops left no gathering shine at the crease, just a scatter of wet that didn't seem to add to itself. I'm a practical man. I went back inside and wrote down the numbers. The tipping bucket agreed. 5 millimeters in 24 hours. Any farmer would call that nothing. On the last night, just after midnight, the radio woke on its own and hissed quietly. I rolled over and listened. Through the static, a voice threaded, low and level, the way a ranger sounds after a long week. I recognized it as my own voice. Outpost 3, it said, calm and a little tired. Precipitation ongoing. Then the faintest irregular knock, like a pencil tapping wood. I sat up slowly and watched the radio light. The voice came again, the same sentence, the same tone. I reached out and clicked the set off. The rain on the roof didn't change. Upstairs, the tick resumed, measuring a space that had nothing in it. I don't scare easily out there. Things make sounds, wind plays tricks, but a man knows his voice. I made coffee, strong and bitter enough to remind me I was the person drinking it, and I waited for dawn with the logbook open. The last entry reads like any other: date, time, temp, wind calm, pressure steady, precip 6 millimeters. In the margin I wrote, against habit, rain continuous, accumulation inconsistent with acoustic intensity. Long words to avoid writing what I was thinking. It rained all week, but didn't. When the road dried enough for the truck to trust it, I drove out listening for the moment the rain would fade on the roof. It never did. The sound stayed with me down the switchbacks, a soft sheet that didn't belong to the windshield, through the draw, past the gate, all the way until I hit the county road and the first heat shimmer rose off the asphalt. Then, clean as someone closing a book, the noise stopped. The sudden quiet felt like stepping out of a machine room into snow. I pulled over and sat there, with the engine idling, hands on the wheel, aware that my ears were still waiting for the tick upstairs. The supervisor signed off my report with a quick nod, skimmed the marginalia, and said, "Sometimes you camp under a drum. Happens." I didn't argue. People need easy things to say about hard-to-name experiences. The other tech from the lower station met me at the lot and asked if he'd heard the same thing he did. Rain never let up, but my creek stayed shy all week. Panels stayed dusty under the eaves. We looked at each other and then at nothing, which is what you do when you agreed not to say more. I still go out to the high stations when they need someone who doesn't mind being alone with a notebook. On calm nights at home, when a real storm finally comes, I'll catch myself listening for that precise, unbroken sheet of sound the mountain gave me, and for the soft attic tick that logic couldn't cup. It isn't the kind of story that keeps people from the woods. It's the kind that keeps your attention honest. You learn the difference between water you can measure and rain you can hear, and you make your notes either way. If the voice on the radio answers back in yours, you turn the set off and boil coffee. And if you ever find the eaves dry while the roof sings, you remember to write it down clean and without adjectives. Some places have their own weather. Some cabins do too.